Good afternoon, everyone. This is Meredith Ward with NASCIO. I'm joined here by my colleague Megan Smith of NASPO, and we have a couple of other speakers for you today. But before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to go over a little bit of background information about how we got here. And I guess before I do that, I should give a couple of housekeeping notes. Everyone is muted right now except for the speaker, so if you do want to ask a question at the end, feel free to type that in the chat box, and we'll be sure and take a look at that. So anyway, as I said, welcome to the NASCIO-NASPO webinar on IT procurement negotiations. Today we'll be giving you highlights of our publication that was released in late September, and also diving just a little bit deeper into some of the things that we highlighted there. And if we move on to the next slide, today we have some fabulous speakers. I'd like to introduce Jim Smith, who is the CIO for the state of Maine, and he was the task force co-chair along with Sarah Hildebrand, who's a CPO from Idaho. So together they are the dynamic duo. They were fantastic co-chairs, and they'll be talking with us today. And like I said, my name is Meredith Ward with NASCIO, and I'm joined here by my colleague Megan Smith of NASPO.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon. So just a little bit about the origins of how NASCIO and NASPO started to work together and the task force. Our two associations really have been working closely on the issue of IT procurement reform for about the last 2 years. We both agreed on a set of recommendations, and then we held a roundtable where we talked more in depth about this. And then about a year ago, NASPO invited NASCIO to start the task force on IT procurement negotiations. And that was because I talked about the 5 recommendations. One of those was to improve the negotiations process, so you can see the 5 there. And if you'd like more information on these, they're on our website and also NASPO's website. So like I said, we mutually agreed that improving the negotiations process was the best place to start, and so we formed this task force, and there were members from 15 states, CIOs and CPOs, and we really worked over the majority of the first part of this year on this issue. So the things that we'll be talking about today are a product of the surveys from our 2 memberships, the work that the task force did in an on-site meeting, and some of the other work that our 2 associations have done together. So next slide. All right, so one thing that we talk about a lot, and when we talk about how did we get here and why did we really want to focus on IT procurement, especially in negotiation. As we all know, the face of IT is really changing. How we procured things, and especially how we procured IT and how IT is different today than it was yesterday. And so this is a graphic from NASCIO's 2017 State CIO survey that came out in October, and it really talks about business models and how CIOs and states are using different services. And so as we can see from 2015 to 2017, there's really been a shift in how CIOs and how states are delivering or obtaining services to their states. So in the next slide, this was very, very important. When we got together as a task force, Jim Smith and Sarah Hildebrand really wanted us to focus on these specific issues. And one thing that we've kind of remembered through the whole way is that we can't continue to solve old IT solutions, solve IT issues with old technology solutions. So Jim and Sarah, kind of the first question for you. What are the high points of each of those bullets up there, and what does that really mean to you? And I'll pick on Sarah first, I guess.
Well, I'll pick out a few of them. You know, I think flexibility to the RFP, you know, and that is going to tie in the ability to negotiate and emphasis on solutions. And I think from the procurement side, we really talked a lot about how can we change the way we put together our solicitations to make them more solution-driven, especially for the big IT projects, the custom solutions, not so much, you know, the routine IT hardware or COTS software purchases, But let's move away from the 200-page RFP that's completely prescriptive, where we tell the IT vendor exactly how we want them to get to the solution, and allow them to propose that solution, which then would give us more flexibility throughout that procurement process in terms of ultimately what that contract's going to look like. I think the other piece, in terms of the ability to negotiate, and we'll talk about it more on some of the rest of these slides, I think the key there really is each state has provisions in code that allow for varying degrees of negotiation. But we really have to be proactive in how we address that, because if we don't build that flexibility initially into the solution, then we're not creating that fair and level playing field. We're not putting vendors on notice in terms of what we can negotiate. So I think a lot of it has to come to that upfront work, and that's going to take the collaboration between the CIOs, the CPOs, and also getting that input from the industry well in advance of even putting together our solicitation.
Yeah, this is Jim. I agree completely with Sarah, and I think, Meredith, when you started the talk this afternoon, and you referred to that first page of the slide deck, not the one with our pictures, although that was good, but that next slide that really talked about the changing nature of technology, and I really think that drives so much of this. It's the bullet here, dealing with the speed of technology improvement. We, on the technology side, the CIO side, are looking so much at this challenge to say, can we use Agile? Can we use different ways to produce? Can we use third parties or SaaS solutions, software as a solution, software as a service solution, to really speed up the business value delivery to our agency partners? And that, if you're going to do that, if you're going to say on the technology side, I got to be faster, either coding or adapting something or something like that, then you really got to look at the procurement side. As Sarah alluded to there, you can't have a procurement that's taking you a year and a half. You just have to find a way to shorten that cycle, but to also, minimize risk and get the best value. And I think that's what the group that worked over the last year and a half together has really thought about. How can we make that process, how can we speed that process up and continue to get value and continue to minimize risk? And I think as you look at the bullets on this page, that's really what that is. And, some of the things we know, a couple of states are doing the pre-qualification of vendors. I believe California's doing, I think Ohio's doing. We know a couple of states are out there doing those type of things. And we want to all learn from each other and steal the best ideas and see what's working. Because one nice thing about all the 50 states, they can work together. It's sort of this big experiment. We can all work and learn from each other.
Great. Thank you, Jim and Sarah. So we'll move on now, and this is Megan, by the way, and we're going to move into the section where we talk a little bit about the survey results. So as Meredith said at the beginning, we began the work of the task force with a survey. We wanted to find out a baseline for what states are currently doing, how they're doing it, and how well it's working for them or not working, as it may be. So 40 states responded to our survey, which gave us a nice baseline for the statistics you will see today. Those results were combined and analyzed, and that's how we came to the 4 focus areas, and we'll touch on each of those as we move through the survey results and discuss them today. So first we asked, who is negotiating? So when we built this map, we actually used pretty much any form of negotiation. If a state told us they were negotiating post-award T's and C's, we included that in this map. So this gives us a nice overview of the fact that almost all of our states are in fact negotiating. So Jim and Sarah, let's talk about what we discussed at the workshop, which was, when we say negotiation, what do we mean by that? And of course that's sort of a core question that we started out with, and that created a really great discussion at the workshop. So could you all talk a little bit about how we approach the issue of what do we mean when we say negotiation, and why negotiation was such an important place for us to start with this work together?
Well, I think, this is Sarah, that's kind of, the basis of our entire discussion, and it was, do we all define negotiating the same way? And it was quite clear that among, between CPOs and CIOs and among CPOs and CIOs in the various states, we all had a little bit different definition. there are states that can do a clarification. At some point that might rise to the level of negotiation, but there's a gray area there. Or are we at the extreme where negotiation is when we put everything out on the table and everything's open to negotiation? So I think this was a difficult question for CPOs and CIOs to answer because of that wide spectrum of, what defines negotiation. For some states, I know that we have code provisions which kind of help define what a negotiation is. It might talk about material terms and conditions in terms of negotiating. And for most states, our code provisions are also going to tell us what we can and can't negotiate. And sometimes they're going to give us that additional flexibility, and they're going to allow us to insert into our solicitation what is subject to negotiation. I know Oregon, for example, at our task force meeting, commented that they will identify the exact material terms which they will allow suppliers to negotiate once they get to an apparent successful proposer. That way, they're putting everyone on notice. It's fair. They've still got that level playing field. But I think, whenever we talk about negotiation, it really comes back to what's public procurement all about. It's about creating a fair and level playing field, which means all of the suppliers have to be on notice as far as, what are the rules of engagement. They have to know what they can and can't negotiate. But from a procurement perspective, we need to work closely with our CIO, our end users, and understand what we need to build into the solicitation to allow that flexibility.
Yeah, this is Jim, and I agree completely there. And I think that, it starts with the definition of negotiate. What is a negotiation? And I think what, Sarah talked about Oregon and stuff. I think one of the fun things about the discussion is we learned how other people are approaching this, how other states are thinking about this, and some of the clever ways they're approaching this. Now, if you look at the map, I put Maine as red and saying we're not negotiating because when I come to negotiation, I think of sort of my private industry background where I could, put two vendors in a room and say, well, this one's going to give me a free year of storage. What are you going to do? And as Sarah mentioned, it's a different world when you get into the public sector, and you got to keep that even playing field, and it's a little more time consuming. Doesn't mean it can't be done. Here in Maine, we're looking at changing some laws, changing some policies and practices to start to introduce that stuff. But I was excited to hear some of the ideas states are doing, and that people are really addressing this, because prior to this, if I was doing a deal in Maine, I was choosing that vendor. We were making the award, and then we'd sit down and negotiate. Well, that's the wrong time in the process to negotiate, because you're already beyond where you have the ability to walk away from something. You're beyond that. You've already made your decision. So we're working with our procurement group and very receptively, and we're finding ways to have a different approach to that and look at negotiation. But I really thought the best thing was just the great ideas we heard from everyone.
Yeah, and I would agree, and I think that was part of the benefit is, as Jim alluded to earlier, having all 50 states, having this discussion together, essentially, we can find where that flexibility is. We can see what other states are doing in terms of finding, some creative solutions that still maintain that fair and level playing field.
Great discussion, guys. So I see a couple of questions about how we shaded the rest of the map. The 40 states that responded gave us their answers. We also did some independent research into state statutes and procurement codes, and we filled in the map appropriately according to all of that information combined together. And please continue to add your questions into the chat box if you wish as we move along. And we'll answer what questions we can here, and if you have questions afterwards, you can always email myself or Meredith. Absolutely. And one of the things, Sarah, that you kind of talked about in your comments, and something that's come up a lot at the workshop and also in our task force work, is maybe the issue of semantics, because you said that maybe CIOs and CPOs had trouble answering what does negotiation mean. Or are they actually negotiating that question? And I also think that we also had maybe some question, or there was some discussion about CIOs and CPOs may mean two different things, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but great discussion. So of course, when we asked, excuse me, who's negotiating, we also had to ask, what are you negotiating? So I think maybe when we started out the task force, we thought we might find states who are negotiating like the private sector, maybe pitting, one vendor against the other, and we really didn't find that in any states. Or if a state's doing that, we're not aware.
Yeah, if you're on the phone and you're doing that.
Yeah, raise your hand. Yeah, let us know. Send us an email. But so when CIOs and CPOs told us, what are you able to negotiate? Again, scope of work, roles and responsibilities, timelines, pricing, things like that. So like I said, and these are just some examples, so it really does run the gamut. So for Jim and Sarah, maybe is there something, and for Maine, we know you aren't really negotiating, but is there something that you are negotiating that you think that, what's the most important thing to negotiate? And this could just be your opinion, too.
Yeah, I'll start. This is Jim. I mean, it's really, defining that. What is negotiation? What is the goal of negotiation as you work with your procurement area and other areas? And, at the end of the day, it's better value. It might be price, but it might be something else. And it's really what's the best value for the citizens of the state. And, we talked at the beginning of the meeting about the changing nature of technology and what state IT supports today versus, 10 or 15 years ago. And it's become much more of a, there's much more third parties involved, and you become much more aggregators and vendor management and dealing with outcomes and services and stuff. And so that changes a little bit one of the things you're looking at. We added a clause over the last couple of years about, we have here thing liability insurance. Well, we started to add some cyber security liability in there on the part of the providers. And, we talked along about that internally about, it'll be easier for the bigger vendors. With smaller vendors, we'll struggle with this when we say, if you somehow expose our PII, there's going to be a cost to that and that kind of stuff. And we spent some time with that and say, do we do it by the number of records? How do we do that? How do we understand cost? Those type of things are things we're now starting to negotiate and talk to providers about, and those weren't part of the discussion 10 or 15 years ago. So we see the nature of that changing. The goal is still obviously what's the best value you can get. But the nature of some of those discussions is changing and evolving.
Yeah, and I think, going back to just, defining negotiation, we also talked about, when does this conversation occur? Because sometimes we don't think it's a negotiation when it's during the Q&A, during a solicitation, right? But really, that is a form of negotiation. So there's opportunities, whether it's through the request for information process, when suppliers make suggestions and tell us about, what the industry standard is, and we either obviously accept or reject that when we put our specifications together. And then when we issue a solicitation, we've got our question and answer period, and, we want suppliers to challenge specifications, to give us alternative language and then explain to us, why that's in the best interest of both the state and, whichever suppliers are proposing on that particular project. So there are negotiations there, and I think a lot of states might not think of it that way. But when we negotiate during the process and prior to closing, then we're still maintaining that fair and level playing field. Some of these examples on the slide, timelines, delivery specifications, we might not necessarily think of those as negotiation when we work through a project plan, once we have a contract in place. That's just part of the flexibility we want to build into that project plan. But, if I had to say, just my opinion of the most important things to be able to negotiate, it's typically the roles, responsibilities, and the expectations. So it's making sure, as with any contract, who's doing what, when is it going to happen, what's going to happen if it doesn't occur, during the time frame in which it is supposed to occur. And I think that's where typically most contracts fail, is those roles, responsibilities, expectations, and then doing the performance monitoring and following through.
So absolutely, thanks, Sarah. And so we asked everyone, are you negotiating? What are you able to negotiate? And then, of course, we have to ask, has that been beneficial to your state? And so, as you can see, the majority of folks said, yeah, this has been beneficial. And I do want to address one question that's in the chat box about protests. From what was reported to us, there have been no successful protests related to negotiations. So, overall what we have found is CIOs and CPOs think that this has been a fairly positive thing when it is used when appropriate. So, Jim and Sarah, we talked a little bit about this, but, how do you see negotiations benefiting your state, or is there something you would like to expand within negotiations? You can take that route as well.
I think for us here in Idaho, using the Q&A, using the RFI process, we really need to expand that, and we've tried to increase awareness out to the suppliers and provide some additional training. We've added language to our templates to encourage participation in that Q&A process, and we've also tried to address what provisions could be subject to negotiation, following the closing for the apparent successful. So I think we're taking steps toward that. I think it is definitely going to be beneficial. A number of proposers have taken advantage of that, and I think they see that as us increasing our flexibility. But ultimately, we're working on, and we've talked with other states about putting together a template solicitation that really is solution-driven for these larger IT custom procurements. And I think if we could have some commonality, even between a handful of states, for these bigger projects, I think that's going to benefit the supplier community as well. And hopefully we can work together as states to then, address the negotiation piece and build that procurement in a way that'll either be iterative and agile, result in master contracts where we've got suppliers who are pre-qualified, and then we're able to negotiate project service orders because we've built that into the pre-qualification, or look for other solutions, kind of like that one of those first slides where we had all those different tools that we could have in place.
And I think that whether we're negotiating in a classic sort of private industry sense, or we're doing it more on we're a public sector, we've got to keep things equitable, but, we can negotiate parts of this stuff and service delivery and some of the things Sarah mentioned. I think what I've seen in the 5 or 6 years I've been here is the discussion is changing. We're having much more of a discussion about what they call a negotiation, or whatever the term you want to use, much more discussion about value delivery. How can we find the right partners? How can they share our vision? How can we understand where they're going? And really get that conversation down to the value at the end of the day. And, there's been so many high-profile projects that haven't completed at different state levels and the federal levels that I think there's a change in emphasis now. And people are really taking a lot closer look at their vendor relationships and how they're, which obviously starts with the RFP and the contract, and how they get the best value out of that. I think the world's evolving, and maybe tomorrow we're not negotiating in the classic sense, but you can feel it. It's almost like you feel the culture changing. You can see more and more awareness of this, more and more areas beyond technology are becoming more technology savvy, in the agencies and in procurement and all our different areas, and just technologies in everyone's lives now, and people are understanding it more and taking a lot of interest in it and really working hard to drive that value.
So Jim, I like that you brought up the question of value, because one graph that we don't have in our slides, but I'll just mention quickly, is that we asked CIOs and CPOs about getting the best value and the best cost for their state, and CIOs and CPOs generally agree that yes, the best cost savings and best value, that the IT procurement process is working for that. Where there was some disagreement was on if the process is able to get the most innovative technology for states. And we thought that could be an issue, again, of semantics, that what do CIOs mean when they say most innovative technology, and what do CPOs mean, and do they mean the same thing? Do they mean different? So, perhaps in our future work together, that might be something that we delve into.
Yeah, and I think that, the classic on that one is agile services, because when you're procuring agile services, you have a big picture where you're going, but as Sarah mentioned in the beginning, you don't have a prescriptive RFP. You say, this is a journey, and I'm going to decide sprint after sprint if I'm going to continue, and I may change direction in the journey. So you're really buying capability through a vendor. So it's a little different discussion than saying, I want X widgets at the end of this 2-year process. Here you're saying, I want to go on a journey with you. The journey isn't, we haven't mapped it out completely, but we know we want to take a journey. We need your capabilities and expertise. That gets a little trickier in the RFP and contracting process, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we, we've talked a lot about kind of big picture type of things, I would say. But through our work together and when we surveyed our memberships, really some things kind of came to the top. And we've talked about some of that so far. But, excuse me, Megan's making me cry, you guys. I apologize. But typical. So we came up with 4 key themes for the results that we found with the survey. And so relationship building, number 1, centralization of IT procurement, procurement process partnerships, and strategies for policy and legislation. Megan, do you like to talk about relationship building?
Thank you, Meredith. I would. So one of the key focuses of our survey questions were on relationships. So we asked, so this particular graph, there's a lot more in the paper itself, so we, of course, encourage you to read the paper and look at all of the statistics included there. But one question we asked was, how often do you meet with your CPO or CIO? So we actually found that you are meeting. Most of them are meeting at least monthly or even more weekly, is 27%, so pretty high numbers there. So if that's true, if CIOs and CPOs are meeting early and often, as we often say, our question here was sort of, well, if that's the case, why isn't satisfaction with IT procurement better? Why isn't the process working better than it is? So our hypothesis here was that it may be an issue of quantity over quality. So maybe we're lacking quality engagement, the quality engagement between the CPO and the CIO and their staff to make things better. So that was something that we focused on. Obviously, in the title of the task force, our focal point was negotiations, but we ended up spending a lot of time on the relationship piece. And you'll notice in the paper that almost half of it is our case study portion. So we did case studies on the states of Alabama and Minnesota and how their CPO and CIO work together. So that was a key piece of our paper. So it was an interesting spectrum here as we see how often you meet with your CPO and CIO, and just making sure that you're having those regular meetings and that you're communicating, however that happens. If it's better by email, if it's better with in-person meetings, as long as they're communicating, we found that those relationships were stronger than where they were not regularly communicating. So based on all of that information, again, the amalgamation of we had open-ended responses from the survey, we had the in-person workshop, and then our anecdata, as I like to call it, people telling us things. We built these recommendations on top of all of that information. So I think at first glance, it might be easy to look at this and say, well, that's awfully warm and fuzzy, and I guess we should all stand in a circle and hold hands and talk about our feelings. But really, that relationship piece matters a great deal. And if you look at the case studies, you'll hear these amazing professionals in their field talk about how important those relationships are. Tom Baden actually said, if you don't work on the relationship, it'll come back to bite you in the end. And he is an expert in that area, so I certainly agree with him. So if you focus on, we focused in these on open and honest communication, cross-education, collaboration, and understanding everyone's roles and responsibilities. So one thing I'd like to focus on here is that we say, base your communication and interaction on the assumption that the other party has the best intentions and is working in the best interest of the state. So if you're sitting across the table from someone and you automatically start thinking they're out to get you or they're not on your side and you're not both working in the best interest of the state, it's going to go downhill from there. So one of our recommendations is to try to start back at square one and assume that everyone's working toward the best interest of the state. So Jim and Sarah, if you all could talk a little bit about what you took away from the task force on the relationship piece, and if that's helped you in your relationships in your state, and what you think others can take away from this portion of the report.
Well, this is Jim. One of the really fun things for this whole project was the ability to sit down with other states and see the CIOs and the chief procurement people working together, meeting together, having great ideas, that kind of stuff. I've been lucky when I walked into the state of Maine. The relationship was already there. We have a great relationship with our procurement office. People were already meeting. They were meeting formally once a month and meeting, more often than that as needed. So it's really a great thing. But I think if you have to have that relationship, as you said at the start of your comments, you really have to have that ongoing relationship and discussion, especially where you look at the things where procurement is changing, it's evolving, and IT is changing and evolving. And boy, you better be in some kind of agreement there as you move forward. But I think a little bit about the two areas actually have goals that are slightly different. Everyone's looking for the best value, of course. And I think of an anecdote when I was at a Fortune 500 company a while ago. We did an interesting thing. We took the negotiation with the vendors. We took it away from IT and gave it to the procurement area, and that caused a lot of angst, and it caused a lot of discussions and disagreements and things like that. And you were saying, I remember we were doing an imaging system, and the IT people were saying, well, procurement people aren't going to know about the imaging system. But the funny thing was, they learned very quickly, and we found quickly that they were better negotiators than we were. And so, you start to think about what's the driving force. Well, the driving force in the IT area is to select the vendor so you can get the product started, you get the project started. The driving force in the procurement area might be more get the best value. So they're complementary, but they're a little bit different. And I think if you acknowledge that, and if you work together with that stuff in mind, that you can get the best from both areas.
Yeah, and I'd agree with Jim completely. I mean, I think it definitely is a symbiotic relationship, and I think that the CPO and CIO need to respect each role and understand each role. And beyond that, I think the task force talked a lot about, it's not just the CPO and the CIO, it's the staff. And so here in Idaho, we actually have a number of our staff in the Division of Purchasing that meets with a number of the OCIO staff on a regular basis. One takeaway from the task force is there's no one model that fits all states. I think whoever selected that they'd never meet, they need to meet. But it needs to be right for, the personalities, for the timelines, for the projects. And I think that when you have those meetings, the staff can talk about their day-to-day experiences. I mean, they're boots on the ground. CPO and CIO, we're looking more enterprise architecture. We're looking ahead. CPO is there to facilitate, the plans that the CIO is putting in place, for the state as a whole. So what we want is, we want the data. We want to know what's coming. And that's difficult sometimes for the CIO to know what's coming 2 or 3 years down the road. It's technology. It's changing all the time. But I think as much as we can have that regular involvement, and a lot of times our discussions, even though we might have, certain topics we want to talk about, other things will come up. And it's great because then we go, oh, that's an aha moment. We know another agency that's working on that. And then we can, get a greater volume around a certain procurement, or we can look at doing statewide contracts, or we can look at doing, master services contracts because we have multiple state needs. So we really rely on that relationship. I think a lot of states do, and you definitely have to have that communication because CPOs, we're process-driven, right? But we want to facilitate that process to get our customer, the CIO, to where they need to be, and we want to get the best value. That's what we're interested in.
Great, thank you guys, and thank you, Sarah, for mentioning the staff, and that is certainly an important thing. And there is a section of the report devoted to just the staff involvement, and also in the case study for Alabama, they just went through a transition to a new CIO, and so that was an opportunity for us to talk about that as well. And if this information is passed down and the staff buys into this model as well, that's always going to help in a transition situation.
Absolutely. And Megan, one of the things that really stood out to me during when we have talked about relationship building, especially when we had our on-site workshop, I think it was the team from Minnesota who said, it's great to have a good relationship when things are great, but it's even better when things aren't great. And, Jim and Sarah both touched on that a little bit. And I will admit that I was the first one to say, this is pretty elementary, this is obvious, but it really isn't, because if you can get a good relationship, then a lot of other things really can work itself out. It's kind of like marriage counseling, CIOs and CPOs, but things can be a lot easier to work out. So I will also say we've talked about a couple of recommendations here in the relationship building part. The report itself has 18 recommendations. So, you can get that on NASCIO's website and also on NASPO's website if you're interested. Megan and I will also sign a copy if you're interested in presents for the holidays.
Yeah.
So just let us know.
A lovely Christmas gift.
That's right. So moving on to the next key theme on centralization of IT procurement. So when we got responses back from the survey, one key theme or key thing that we heard was in a lot of states that who was in charge or who did what, roles and responsibilities weren't all the time clear. So when we say centralization of IT procurement, it means that there is one entity who is leading the charge and everybody's on the same page about who is supposed to do what. So as you can see in the graph there, as far as who all IT procurement is handled by, that varies from state to state, and it's a fairly even split, except the 12% right there. So if we move on to the recommendations from centralization of IT procurement, I'll point out two for you. One of the most important ones that we really harped on was don't focus on who owns IT procurement, rather focus on having the tools needed for successful IT procurement. So one of the things that if you've been in IT procurement for any amount of time, you know that sometimes CIO could own IT procurement, and that's a lot lower number than central procurement within the central procurement office. And a lot of times it maybe something has gone wrong or something has changed, and so ownership may travel in between the CIO or the CPO. And so our recommendation is really to don't focus on who owns it, focus on working together, focus on making sure that the state and whoever the entity is who's on point, who's on lead, has what they need to get the job done. So I'll throw that talking point out here in a second, but also want to touch on and Sarah, you talked about enterprise architecture earlier. But to stay in or change to be in alignment with the state's enterprise standards and architecture-driven technology plan. For the CIOs and the folks in the CIO offices who are on the phone, this is extremely important and something that CIOs are constantly focusing on from day to day. And so that relationship piece of educating all agencies, but especially the CPO, about what is your plan and how can you be aligned with the enterprise architecture plan. So I'll throw that out to Sarah and Jim, and what's the importance there of enterprise architecture when it comes to IT procurement?
Well, I think this is Jim. I'll start. The architecture really determines the technology roadmap. That's really your vision for the future, right? And so, as we talked about at the start of this conversation, the world of technology is changing. We're having conversations now about, cloud and cybersecurity through third parties and things like that we weren't having 5 or 10 years ago, and we're having them all the time now. And this has an impact on our procurement. And in fact, we're becoming, I'd even say we're becoming more procurement savvy because we have to be, right? Because we're buying more and more of the the services. Well, to do that, you really need that architectural roadmap. And I think that both the procurement and the technology area have to be aligned with where that's going and what's your vision and where's your world going. And that way, you find the best values and find the best vendor partners and things like that. But you're really going to have that vision. You're going to have that architecture, or else you'll end up with chaos. You'll be all over the place if you end up with 100 different solutions for the same type of problem. So you really got to have some sort of vision and some discipline around that and work together to fulfill that vision.
Yeah, and I think from a procurement perspective, we need to understand what that technology roadmap looks like so that we can align our procurements, we can use the right type of solicitations, put the contracts in place that need to be in place for different services, hardware, whatever it is, and for the proper lengths of time so that we can have those contracts aligned so that we can have them evolve with changing technology. But we're also interested in enhancing vendor management, tracking their performance, having streamlined terms and conditions to make these contracts more efficient and to make the procurement process more efficient, but also being able to give visibility to what's out there, which is going to then give the CIOs better oversight and a better ability to keep that roadmap moving.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jim and Sarah. And want to move on to procurement process partnerships, and I will throw that to my colleague, the gentle lady, Megan Smith.
Thank you, Meredith. So we asked about procurement process partnerships in this way. We gave everyone a sort of nice little chart of the procurement process, and we said, where in this process is your CIO offices consulted? And we asked them to choose all that apply. And we see here like some clear patterns emerge, right? So they are involved in the RFP development, RFP process, and then they sort of skip the bid receipt part, and then they come back for evaluation, scoring, negotiations, and award. So, and then that 3% never, I mean, I hope those people are on the phone and we can help them.
Call us. We'll give you therapy.
Call our 1-800 line.
Yeah.
And we'll help you. So I think the clear trend here is that we want them involved all the way through, right? And especially at the beginning. One of our respondents in the open-ended part used the term cradle to grave, which I don't want the procurement to go to the grave, but I did like that terminology that we are including and involving everyone from beginning to end. So actual implementation of this, however, varied pretty widely, and some people in their open-ended responses said that involvement can mean many different things. But we think that, again, we go back to that quantity versus quality question, and we want quality involvement throughout the process. And then one discussion that came up at the workshop, which I think is very true, is every procurement is a special snowflake, and it's all relative. So everyone should sit down at the beginning and have a conversation about, is this procurement where negotiation is appropriate? And if so, what should we be negotiating? And how should we be preparing for that now before we ever talk about how to write the RFP? So that is something that we really emphasized at the workshop. So I'll move on to our recommendations in this area. So again, we go back to the cross-education idea. And we talk about at the beginning of the procurement process determine if it's permissible to negotiate. And then we encourage writing RFIs and RFPs so that you're buying solutions and not buying things. So that was sort of some of the high points of these. And also the last recommendation there, you see iterative and non-waterfall procurement methodologies. Again, we encourage that as something that can help in IT procurement across the board, really.
And I'll do a shameless plug. NASCIO has also done a lot of work on Agile this year, especially my colleague Eric Sweden. And so, you know, if you're interested in what CIOs and others have to say, I know we also talked to a couple of CPOs about Agile procurement. We do have some information available on our website. I'd be happy to pass along additional information. But, you know, one of the recommendations, Megan, that I kind of wanted to highlight there is the fourth one, I believe, if my eyes are working. Work with all parties, including those from the private sector, to set a process which increases flexibility and communication. So I know we have a lot of private sector partners on the phone today, or on the webinar rather, and we thought that that was extremely important because as CIOs and CPOs, you know, let's say they've built a relationship, they're working well together. You know, they're obviously not the only entity in the IT procurement process. And I think that's also something that our two groups hope to address in the future, is how the private sector really fits in there.
Yeah, that came up many times during the workshop. And I will also say on page 18 of the work product, you'll see that we included implementation methods. So not just recommendations, we gave you an actual checklist of things. And included on that list is be aware of and consider the cost to a vendor to participate in the procurement process. So that's something to always consider. And so we always want to mention that those are issues on everyone's mind, on the CPO's mind, on the CIO's mind, and we try to touch on that as much as we could in these recommendations. So the discussion question for Jim and Sarah here, could you all talk a little bit about the thing that we mentioned a little earlier, just because negotiation is possible, does that mean it's always appropriate? And how you guys think that CPOs and CIOs can make that determination about, is this a procurement where negotiation will help?
All right, I'll jump in. So I think, we talked a little bit about it before. If we're doing fairly simple routine, IT hardware solicitations or COTS software, routine maintenance, these should be pretty straightforward. There might be a few areas that might be open to some negotiation. I think what we were talking about more with this task force is really the custom solutions, the bigger IT projects, where we need to find a way to make that solicitation more solution-driven. And the focus on the partnerships, I think, expanded it from the CPO-CIO relationship to how can we involve industry more in this process in a way, of course, that's appropriate within whatever parameters each of our states have. So we talked about, using the RFI process. We talked about, inviting vendors in, pre-proposal meetings, to kind of do that upfront research. I would also point folks to the Cronin finalists that were announced at the NASPO annual meeting, because a lot of the processes they used, we've talked about a little bit here. Tennessee had something called collaborative value, where they found a way to open up the conversation with suppliers and focus on a solution that way. New York presented on umbrella contracts that they put in place for manufacturers. Utah, which ultimately won the Cronin, based on their master contracts with cloud providers that a lot of you, I'm sure, know about with NASPO Value Point. And the topic of their discussion was innovation is collaborative. And I think that collaboration goes beyond the internal folks within the state, and it has to involve the industry partners out there.
Yeah, no need for me to negotiate with Sarah here, because I agree 100% on what she's saying, and I think that involvement of the vendor community and the partners, I think, people really want to do the right thing, and they want to get to the best value and want to get to the best place, and I think that's imperative, and I hope every state is doing it, and it's time consuming, and we've done some of it, but not enough, but I hope we do more of it.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful, you guys. Just excellent commentary here. But, want to move on to our fourth and final high point, if you will, of the document. And this is on policy and legislation. So one thing that I find really interesting, if you've ever been to a NASCIO conference, we've asked this question of our large audience once or twice, and this is, what do you think is the biggest barrier to improving the IT procurement process? And what I always find very interesting is that a lot of folks always say legislation and state legislation, state laws, and a lot of other folks will say policy. And one thing, obviously, that we have found is that it's not always a law, and I think that's a common thing that comes up a lot, that people will say, oh, these laws, they're blocking things, and that's not really true. A lot of times it's a policy or something internal that can be tweaked or modernized to improve or relieve some issues in the process. So we asked our folks, were you involved with the process of making changes to the code, statute, policy required to negotiate an IT procurement? And you can see that just a little over 50% said no, 40% said NA, and only 6% said yes. So that's definitely an issue that we see, because I would hypothesize that where CIOs and CPOs might not be involved in negotiation on the IT procurement process, then perhaps they're not involved as much as they should on the policy and legislative process as well. So also want to go into the recommendations on this section, because I think these are extremely important, and especially, again, when we talk about the internal policies that might need to be updated. But just want to tell you all one little anecdote from the state of Alabama, and this is outlined in the relationship part of the document, but I'll talk about it here. So the CPO from Alabama had a provision that he had really been trying to get passed for the last 5 or 6 years. And what he was able to do, because he had such a great relationship with the former CIO, is when the CIO got some legislation passed, she was able to include the provision that the CPO wanted, and it worked out best for all involved. So that's really huge. I'm sure there are other examples out there. I know that there are. But I think that's just a great example of how CIOs and CPOs can work together and how they can work together on that legislative process. So one thing that we see here, the last recommendation, this is about exploring small-scale IT procurement negotiations to build the case for widespread adoption. And Jim, I know this is something that you were interested in, and what I think this can really do is help with executive buy-in, and that's one thing that we have talked about a lot. So really, maybe Jim and then Sarah, you know, how important is it to have executive buy-in for improving the IT procurement process?
Well, I think that's where it all starts, correct? I mean, that's really, it's a recognition among the states and among, you know, the executives in the states that, no, this is very important. And here in Maine, we've had a procurement, a centralized procurement area in place for a long time, but we just recently hired our first CPO, which is really exciting. And you know what that means? That means that the executives are understanding that, boy, this is very important, and we better get this right. We spend a lot of dollars on procurement. You know, we've seen enough surveys from NASCIO and other places where people saying, we're working pretty hard at this, but we're not getting the results we want. And so how do you look at that? And I think you're exactly right, Meredith. It starts with the executive buy-in, the executive saying, there may be a better way to do this. Let's think about this. Let's push this forward. And as I said, you know, been very great cooperation here in Maine among all the parties there, and we're doing exactly what you said, starting a small-scale IT procurement. And we found, and we sort of had the same thought process that a lot of states did. We said, well, you know, the policies and the legislature prevents us from doing this. And then when we lifted the covers a little bit, we said, well, you know, we have more flexibility here than we knew about. And so we're trying a couple of pilots and trying some negotiation and things like this, and you know, getting down to a couple of vendors and working through with those vendors at the end of the process and stuff. All of this needs that support at that executive level, and it's there. The world's evolving, the world's changing. People are understanding both the risk from failed projects people have seen over the last 4, 5, 6 years, and from the opportunity to say, no, we can really do something here that's going to mean a lot to the citizens of the state.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the other piece of executive support, they need to understand what that technology roadmap looks like, and then they need to understand from the procurement folks kind of what the plan is from a procurement perspective moving forward. We also need to help them understand, you know, the benefits of using different procurement methodologies. What are the benefits? What are the risks? Because they're going to get asked. You know, agencies are our customers as well, you know, when we're centralized, and it's a big culture shift for a lot of the end users out there when we start doing things even slightly differently. So we've got to do our outreach from a procurement perspective. We've got to educate the agency purchasing folks. We're actually in Idaho, we're going to have trainings that are specifically geared just toward the IT folks. They may not even be purchasing anything, but we want them to understand the procurement process and our timelines, and you know, what the rules are, what the code says, where we have flexibility, and we want to understand from them what challenges they've faced from their perspective, because we need to understand that when we put our procurements together. But ultimately, you know, if the director or chief executive officer, if they don't understand what's happening between the CPO and the CIO and what the goals are, they have a difficult time explaining that when they get phone calls from other agency directors. So we definitely need them to understand and to be able to support us in what we're doing.
You know, I think, Sarah, I love that you talked about different procurement methodologies. So, you know, the last kind of recommendation that I'll highlight there is the second one, talking about cooperative purchasing, master service agreements, pre-qualified vendor pools, and things like that. You know, one of my favorite quotes through this whole process has been from Georgia CIO Calvin Rhodes, and Calvin said, you know, technology right now is the slowest that it will ever be in our lifetimes. And so really kind of to close us out, the call to action, I think, from both of our groups will be to really understand, to really know that the face of IT is changing, so therefore must the face and the way we do things with IT procurement. So, so much excellent information that we are now out of time. I'm not going to get Jim to say lobster because I'm a nice person, but then he'll make fun of my Kentucky accent. Right.
How about scallop?
Shout out to Idaho. So, you know, where you can find our document is up on the screen right now, or it will be in just a second. And feel free to definitely, if there are questions that we didn't get to today, we apologize for that, but you can find my contact information on the NASCIO website. You can find Megan's contact information on the NASPO website. Please feel free to reach out and let us know what you're thinking, if you have questions, things like that. But in the last 2 minutes, Megan, Jim, Sarah, is there anything that we want to that I didn't get to, or any closing comments?
Meredith, I'll just say thank you to Jim and Sarah for their leadership on this task force. True leadership is leading by example, and they have come to this with dedication, and they've shown up to everything we've asked them to do, and we promise this is the last thing.
A lot, so thank you.
So thank you so much to them, and to you, and to NASPO and NASCIO. Partnering together has been a great thing, and we hope to continue our relationship.
Yeah, and thank you, Jim, and thanks so much, Megan and Meredith. You guys have done the lion's share of the work, and you've done a great job. I think the more we can work together to kind of spread the procurement modernization message in the IT sector, I think we're just going to see great things happen.
I agree. Thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone. Like I said, please feel free to check out the document and feel free to get in touch with us. And we are right at 3 o'clock. So thanks so much. Have a lovely Thanksgiving, and hope that y'all will be in touch. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
The host